The rain hadn't stopped since the morning Sarah died, and now, 3 days later, as I stood in the cemetery watching them lower her casket into the ground, I couldn't help but think she would have loved this weather. She always said rain at a funeral meant the heavens were crying with you, and God knows I needed someone to cry with me because I couldn't seem to stop. But what happened next at that funeral would change everything I thought I knew about my wife, her family, and the 12 years we'd spent together. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, you might want to settle in because this story will make you question everything you think you know about love, money, and family. My name is Michael Chen, and yes, before you ask, I'm Asian American, which apparently made it easier for Sarah's family to believe I'd married her for her money. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison came from old Connecticut money, the kind that traced its roots back to railroad barons and shipping magnates. When we met at a charity fundraiser in New York City 14 years ago, I was a struggling programmer working 80-hour weeks at a startup that would eventually fail spectacularly, and she was working as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a job she'd gotten entirely on her own merit despite her family's connections. The first thing she ever said to me was that I was holding my champagne glass wrong. And when I told her I didn't know there was a wrong way to hold a glass, she laughed so hard she snorted, then immediately covered her nose in embarrassment. That's when I knew I was in trouble because that snort was the most genuine thing I'd heard at that stuffy fundraiser all night. We dated for 2 years before I proposed, and during that time I met her family exactly 3 times. Her parents, William and Margaret Morrison, lived in a mansion in Greenwich that looked like it belonged in a museum itself, all marble floors and oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors. Her older sister, Victoria, was a carbon copy of their mother, all sharp angles and sharper words, married to an investment banker named Charles who collected vintage cars he never drove. Her younger brother, James, was the only one who seemed genuinely happy to meet me, probably because he was the black sheep who'd become a public school teacher instead of going into finance. The first dinner with them was so uncomfortable that Sarah apologized for 3 hours straight on the drive home, promising me that we didn't have to see them often. She kept that promise too, limiting our interactions to major holidays and the occasional birthday, though even those visits felt like walking through a minefield, where any wrong step would trigger an explosion of passive-aggressive comments about our small apartment in Queens or my beat-up Honda Civic. The wedding was where things really started to show their true colors. Sarah wanted something small, maybe 50 people at most, in the botanical garden where we'd had our 3rd date. Her mother wanted 400 of their closest friends at the country club, with a reception that would have cost more than I made in 3 years. Sarah stood her ground and we had our small wedding, but half her family didn't show up, claiming various scheduling conflicts that we both knew were lies. Victoria gave a toast that was more like a eulogy for Sarah's potential, talking about all the things her sister could have achieved if she hadn't settled down so young and with someone so. She'd paused there, letting the silence speak volumes before finishing with, different from us. Sarah had squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that Victoria's opinion was worth about as much as Confederate money, which made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on my champagne, the glass of which I was now holding correctly. Thank you very much. Our life together was nothing like what her family expected or wanted for her. We lived in that same small apartment in Queens for 5 years, saving money and building our careers. I'd moved from startups to a steady job at a tech company that paid well but nothing spectacular, while Sarah had worked her way up to senior curator. We cooked dinner together every night we were both home, watched old movies on our second-hand couch, and took camping trips instead of flying to Europe. Her family saw this as me holding her back from the lifestyle she deserved, but Sarah always said she was living exactly the life she wanted. When we finally bought a house, it wasn't in Connecticut or Westchester like her parents hoped, but in a diverse neighborhood in New Jersey where our neighbors were teachers and firefighters and small business owners. Sarah planted a vegetable garden in the backyard and learned to can tomatoes from our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who became more of a mother to her than Margaret Morrison ever was. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March, exactly 1 year and 4 months before she died. Sarah had been tired lately, but we blamed it on her latest exhibition project, a massive undertaking involving loans from museums around the world. When she fainted at work and they took her to the emergency room, we thought maybe she was anemic or had been skipping too many meals. The doctor who delivered the news looked younger than us, with kind eyes that seemed to age 10 years as he explained that the scans showed masses in her liver and lungs. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, he said, as if those words made any sense in the context of my healthy, vibrant 38-year-old wife, who had just run a half marathon 2 months earlier. Sarah had taken the news with a strange calm, holding my hand and asking practical questions about treatment options. While I sat there feeling like someone had removed all the air from the room, and I was slowly suffocating in the vacuum left behind, she didn't tell her family for 3 months. During that time, we went through the brutal first rounds of chemotherapy, the radiation treatments that left her skin raw and painful, the experimental trial that our insurance wouldn't cover, and that we paid for by emptying our savings account. I took family medical leave from work, and we spent those months in a bubble of hospital rooms and home care, watching entire seasons of British mystery shows and reading books aloud to each other when she was too tired to hold the pages herself. When she finally told her family, it was only because she'd lost so much weight that there was no hiding it at James's birthday dinner. Her mother's first response wasn't to ask how she was feeling or what she needed, but to criticize us for not telling them sooner, as if Sarah's cancer was a social faux pas we'd committed. Victoria immediately started researching the best oncologists in Switzerland, not seeming to understand that we were well past the point where throwing money at the problem would solve anything. The last good month we had was December, when the treatment seemed to be working and Sarah had enough energy to decorate for Christmas. She went absolutely overboard, putting lights on every surface and buying an enormous tree that barely fit in our living room. She insisted on hosting Christmas dinner, inviting not just her family but also Mrs. Rodriguez, my parents who flew in from California, and 3 of her colleagues who had nowhere else to go. It was chaos, with too many people crowded into our small dining room, the turkey slightly overcooked and Victoria making snide comments about the mismatched plates. But Sarah was radiant that night, wearing a ridiculous Christmas sweater with actual jingle bells sewn onto it, laughing at James's terrible jokes and helping Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson with his college application essays between courses. When everyone had left and we were cleaning up, she told me that was exactly how she wanted to be remembered, surrounded by people she loved in a home filled with warmth and laughter, not in some sterile mansion where everyone was afraid to spill red wine on the white carpets. January brought the news that the cancer had spread to her bones and brain. The doctor started talking about making her comfortable, about quality of life versus quantity, about hospice care. Sarah had been remarkably clear-headed about her wishes, filling out advance directives and making lists of things she wanted me to know, from how to care for her orchids to which dry cleaner did the best job with delicate fabrics. She spent hours on the phone with James, making him promise to live his life without apology, to keep teaching even though their parents thought it was beneath him. She had lunch with colleagues, passing on her knowledge and making sure her current exhibition would be completed to her standards. But with her parents and Victoria, she remained distant, polite but closed off, as if she was protecting herself from something even in her final weeks. The last 2 weeks were spent in hospice, a beautiful facility with gardens visible from every window and staff who treated us like family. I practically lived there, sleeping in the recliner next to her bed, reading her favorite poems when she was awake and holding her hand when she wasn't. Her family visited in shifts, her mother bringing enormous flower arrangements that had to be moved to other rooms because they overwhelmed the small space. Her father sitting stiffly in the corner checking his phone every 5 minutes. Victoria constantly stepping out to take calls from her office. Only James seemed to understand what Sarah needed, bringing her favorite ice cream, even though she could only manage a spoonful, playing her favorite songs on his guitar even when she was too tired to open her eyes. The last coherent thing she said to me was that marrying me was the best decision she ever made, that every moment of our 12 years together was worth more than a lifetime of the alternative. She died at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday, just as the sun was starting to light up the gardens outside her window, and I swear I felt her squeeze my hand one last time before she let go. The funeral arrangements became a battle I didn't have the energy to fight. Margaret Morrison took over, planning a service at their Episcopal church in Greenwich even though Sarah hadn't attended church since college. Choosing hymns Sarah would have hated, and a casket that cost more than most people's cars. I managed to insist on a few things like having James play guitar and including a reading from Mary Oliver, Sarah's favorite poet, but mostly I just went along with it, too exhausted and grief-stricken to argue about flower arrangements and reception venues. The service itself was surreal, with hundreds of people who barely knew Sarah talking about what a tragedy it was, how much potential had been lost, how young she was. I wanted to scream at them that they had no idea who she really was, that the Sarah they were mourning was a fiction created by their own expectations and projections. It was at the reception, held at the Morrison Family Country Club, when Victoria cornered me near the bar. She'd had several glasses of wine by then, her usually perfect composure starting to crack around the edges. She started by saying how difficult this must be for me, how lost I must feel without Sarah to guide me through their world. When I didn't respond the way she expected, didn't gratefully accept her condescension, she became more direct. She mentioned how expensive Sarah's medical bills must have been, how difficult it would be for someone in my position to handle the estate taxes, how the family could help me transition to a more appropriate situation if I was reasonable about things. That's when I realized she thought I was going to inherit everything and was trying to convince me to give it up voluntarily. The fury that rose in me was so intense I had to physically walk away before I said something that would have caused a scene at my wife's funeral. But Victoria wasn't done. As more wine flowed and the reception wore on, she became bolder, louder, less concerned about appearances. She started telling anyone who would listen about how I'd isolated Sarah from her family, how I'd convinced her to live below her means, how suspicious it was that Sarah had gotten sick so young. The implications were clear even if she never said it outright. I was a gold digger who had somehow manipulated her sister into marriage and was now about to profit from her death. Most people were too polite to engage, but I could see some of them listening, nodding, filing away this gossip for later discussion. Margaret Morrison did nothing to stop her daughter, just sat there with her perfect posture and her practiced smile, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that never actually showed any tears. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Monday at the offices of Whitman, Carruthers and Associates, the law firm that had handled the Morrison family's affairs for generations. I arrived early, wearing the only suit I owned that wasn't bought for the funeral, and sat in the waiting room trying not to think about how Sarah would have laughed at the pretentiousness of it all, with its leather-bound books that had never been read, and oil paintings of stern-looking men who were probably the founding partners. The Morrison family arrived together, a united front in their designer black clothing and carefully composed expressions. Victoria looked at me with barely concealed contempt, while Margaret Morrison didn't look at me at all, treating me like I was furniture that someone had inexplicably placed in her path. Harold Whitman himself was handling the reading, a man in his 70s who looked like he'd stepped out of a different century, with his three-piece suit and gold pocket watch. He had known Sarah since she was a child, and I could see genuine sadness in his eyes as he greeted each of us and led us into a conference room that was bigger than my entire first apartment. We sat around a massive mahogany table, the Morrison family on one side and me on the other, like we were negotiating a business deal rather than hearing the last wishes of the woman I loved. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat and began with the standard legal language about Sarah being of sound mind and body when the will was created, dated just 6 months before her death. The first few bequests were small personal things: her collection of first edition poetry books to James, her grandmother's pearl necklace to her college roommate, a donation to the museum where she'd worked. Then Mr. Whitman paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at Victoria as he read the next part. To my sister Victoria Morrison Blackwood, I leave the silver picture frame from my desk, the one holding the photo from my wedding day. May it remind you that happiness comes in many forms, not all of them recognized by our social circle. Victoria's face flushed red, but before she could respond, Mr. Whitman continued, "To my parents, William and Margaret Morrison, I leave my love and my forgiveness, though I suspect they will value neither as much as they would have valued a more obedient daughter." The room was completely silent, except for the sound of Mr. Whitman turning the page. I could feel the tension radiating from the other side of the table, the barely contained fury at these posthumous insults delivered in Sarah's distinctive voice. But Mr. Whitman wasn't done. "The remainder of my estate," he read, his voice steady and clear, "consisting of all financial assets, real property, and personal belongings not otherwise specified, I leave to..." He paused here, and I swear it was for dramatic effect, because Sarah would have absolutely insisted on that pause. I leave to absolutely no one, as there is nothing to leave. All assets have been properly distributed prior to my death in accordance with my wishes and the law. The explosion was immediate. Victoria shot to her feet, actually pointing at me across the table as she accused me of coercing Sarah, of manipulating a dying woman into giving me everything before she died. Margaret Morrison's composure finally cracked as she demanded to know what had happened to Sarah's trust fund, to the inheritance from her grandmother, to the life insurance policies. William Morrison was threatening to contest the will, to have me investigated for elder abuse and fraud. Through it all, Mr. Whitman sat there with a slight smile on his face, the kind that suggested he was rather enjoying this scene. And I remembered Sarah telling me once that Harold Whitman had been the only adult who'd encouraged her to pursue her own path when she was young. When the shouting finally died down to a level where he could be heard, Mr. Whitman held up his hand and spoke again. "If I may continue," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been dealing with wealthy families' dramas for 50 years. "There is a letter here from Sarah to be read in the event of such confusion." He pulled out an envelope and opened it with deliberate slowness, unfolding the paper inside with the same theatrical timing Sarah would have used. "My dear family," he began, and I could hear Sarah's voice in every word. "If you are hearing this letter, it means you are upset about the distribution of my estate, or rather, the lack thereof. Let me explain as clearly as possible why Michael inherits nothing from me." Mr. Whitman paused to sip his water, and I thought Victoria might actually leap across the table to snatch the letter from his hands. "Michael inherits nothing because Michael already owns everything. 3 years ago, when I was first diagnosed with cancer, though none of you knew it yet, Michael and I made a decision. We restructured our assets entirely, placing everything we owned in joint tenancy with right of survivorship. The house, the bank accounts, the investment portfolio that I built with my inheritance from grandmother, all of it became jointly owned with full rights of survivorship. This means that upon my death, ownership automatically transferred to Michael by operation of law, not by inheritance. There is no estate to distribute because I died owning nothing in my name alone." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see Victoria's mind working, trying to find a legal angle to attack this arrangement, while Margaret Morrison's face had gone pale as the implications sank in. Mr. Whitman continued reading, his voice carrying Sarah's words with perfect clarity. "I know what you're thinking, especially you, Victoria. You're thinking Michael manipulated me into this, that he took advantage of a sick woman. Let me disabuse you of that notion immediately. This was my idea, my insistence, and Michael actually argued against it for weeks. You see, I knew exactly how my family would react to my death. I knew you would descend like vultures, picking apart whatever was left, using my memory as a weapon against the man I loved. I refused to allow that to happen." The letter went on to detail exactly when and how each transfer had been made, all completely legal and properly documented, most of it done before she'd even told her family she was sick. She had liquidated her trust fund and used it to pay off the mortgage on our house, putting the deed in both our names. She had cashed out her inheritance from her grandmother and put it in joint accounts that she and I had used to pay for her experimental treatments. She had changed the beneficiary on her life insurance policies to Michael years before she got sick, back when we'd first gotten married and her family had made it clear they thought our marriage wouldn't last. Every single financial move had been made with careful deliberation and legal counsel, creating an ironclad structure that left nothing for her family to contest. But the most devastating part of the letter was yet to come. Mr. Whitman's voice softened as he read Sarah's explanation of why she had done this. "I watched my family my entire life, saw how money corrupted every relationship, how it turned love into transaction and family into a business arrangement. Every milestone in my life was evaluated based on its potential return on investment. My education was an investment in marrying well. My career was acceptable only as long as it didn't interfere with my real job of being a Morrison. When I married Michael, a man who loved me for exactly who I was, not for my name or my trust fund or my family connections, you couldn't accept it. You couldn't believe that someone would choose love over money, happiness over status, because you never have." Mr. Whitman paused to let those words sink in before continuing. "Michael never asked me for anything. In 12 years of marriage, he never once suggested we ask my family for money, even when we were struggling to pay for my treatments. He worked extra hours, sold his car, did whatever it took to take care of me without ever making me feel like a burden. While you, my family, visited me in hospice to discuss estate planning and tax implications, Michael read me poetry and held my hand. While you brought lawyers to my deathbed, he brought my favorite flowers from our garden. That is why I made sure he would be protected from you. That is why I structured everything so that there would be nothing for you to take from him. No way for you to punish him for the crime of loving me without conditions. The letter had more to say. Specific messages for each family member that ranged from cutting to compassionate, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was thinking about Sarah, about the strength it must have taken to plan all of this while fighting cancer, to protect me even as she was dying. I was thinking about the conversations we'd had where she'd insisted on these arrangements and I'd argued that her family deserved something, that we shouldn't cut them off completely. She'd laughed and said I was too good for my own good, that I didn't understand how vicious they could be when money was involved. Apparently, she'd been right. When Mr. Whitman finished reading, the room erupted again. William Morrison was on his phone with another lawyer before the last word was spoken. Victoria was screaming about undue influence and diminished capacity, throwing around legal terms she'd probably learned from television shows. Margaret Morrison had started crying, though whether from grief or rage I couldn't tell. Through it all, James sat quietly in his corner, and when I caught his eye, he gave me the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that his sister had done what she needed to do. Mr. Whitman let the chaos continue for a moment, before standing and announcing that his firm would be happy to defend the estate against any challenges, though he doubted very much they would succeed, given the careful documentation of Sarah's mental capacity throughout the process. I left while they were still shouting, walking out of that office and into the bright afternoon sunlight feeling strangely empty, not because of the money, I'd never cared about that, but because this felt like the final goodbye from Sarah, her last act of protecting me from a world she'd been born into, but never really belonged to. I drove home to our house in New Jersey, the one that was now mine alone, and sat in her garden among the tomatoes and roses she'd planted. Mrs. Rodriguez came over with a casserole and sat with me for a while, not saying anything, just being present in the way Sarah's family never knew how to be. The legal challenges came, of course. Victoria hired a team of lawyers to contest everything, claiming I'd isolated Sarah from her family, that I'd exercised undue influence over a dying woman, that the transfers were fraudulent. The problem was, Sarah had anticipated every angle of attack. She'd had multiple doctors certify her mental capacity at regular intervals. She'd made video recordings explaining her decisions, looking directly into the camera and stating clearly that she was doing this of her own free will. She'd even had meetings with financial advisors and lawyers without me present, creating a paper trail that showed these were her independent decisions. Every time Victoria's lawyers thought they'd found an angle, they'd discover Sarah had already blocked it. The most amusing part was when they tried to claim that I'd married Sarah for her money in the first place, that this had been a long con from the beginning. Sarah had apparently anticipated this too, because among the documents Mr. Whitman produced was a prenuptial agreement I'd tried to sign before our wedding, giving up any claim to Sarah's family money. Sarah had refused to let me sign it, had actually torn it up in front of the lawyer, declaring that what was hers would be mine and vice versa, for better or worse. She'd made the lawyer document the entire incident, creating a record that I'd been willing to walk away from her money from the very beginning. During all of this, I continued living our life, or trying to. I went back to work, tended Sarah's garden, had dinner with Mrs. Rodriguez every Sunday. I donated a large sum to the museum in Sarah's name, funding a new education program she'd been developing. I set up a scholarship at James's school for students who wanted to pursue the arts. I did all the things Sarah and I had talked about doing if we ever had money to spare, which, thanks to her careful planning, we now did. Her family saw these donations as further proof that I was squandering their inheritance, not understanding that I was following the wishes Sarah had expressed to me in those last months, wishes she hadn't put in writing because she'd trusted me to carry them out. The breaking point came 6 months after Sarah's death, when Victoria showed up at my door unannounced. She looked different, older somehow, with dark circles under her eyes and a tremor in her hands. She asked if she could come in, and against my better judgment, I let her. She walked through the house like she was seeing it for the first time, taking in the photos of Sarah and me on every surface, the shelves full of books we'd read together, the blanket Sarah had been knitting still draped over her favorite chair, with the needle stuck in the last row she'd completed. Victoria sat down on our couch and started crying, really crying, not the decorative tears she'd produced at the funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised me. When she finally composed herself, she told me something I hadn't known. Sarah had called her the week before she died, when Victoria had been in Europe on business. Sarah had tried to explain why she'd done what she'd done with the money, had tried to make Victoria understand that it wasn't about punishing the family, but about protecting what she and I had built together. Victoria had hung up on her, had refused to take her calls after that, had chosen her anger over her last chance to really talk to her sister. Now she was drowning in regret, realizing too late that she'd spent so much time focused on what Sarah owed the family, that she'd never appreciated what Sarah had tried to give them. An example of a life lived on one's own terms, a marriage based on love rather than convenience, a happiness that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. I made Victoria tea, the same chamomile blend Sarah had always made when someone was upset, and we talked for hours. She told me about growing up as a Morrison, about the pressure to be perfect, to marry well, to produce heirs to continue the family legacy. She told me about watching Sarah rebel against all of it and being jealous not of Sarah's freedom but of her courage to claim it. She admitted that she'd seen me as a threat not because I was after the family money, but because I represented proof that Sarah had been right to reject everything they'd been taught to value. By the time she left, we weren't friends exactly, but we'd reached an understanding. She dropped the legal challenges the next day, and somehow convinced her parents to do the same. James started coming over for dinner once a month, bringing his guitar and playing the songs Sarah had loved. He told me stories about their childhood I'd never heard, about Sarah defending him from bullies, teaching him to ride a bike, sneaking him books their parents had deemed inappropriate. He was getting married next spring to another teacher, a woman his parents disapproved of because she was divorced with 2 kids. And he asked if they could have the reception in our backyard in Sarah's garden. It was the first time he'd ever stood up to his parents about anything, and I could see Sarah's influence in his newfound courage. We spent an entire weekend planning how to arrange the garden for the wedding, and I knew Sarah would have been so proud of him for finally choosing his own happiness over his family's approval. The Morrisons themselves maintained their distance, which was fine with me. I heard through James that they'd told their society friends that Sarah had left everything to charity, unable to admit even now that their daughter had chosen her husband over her family. Margaret Morrison had apparently redecorated Sarah's childhood room, removing all traces of the daughter who hadn't lived there in 20 years. As if she could erase the disappointment of Sarah's choices by erasing Sarah herself. William Morrison threw himself deeper into his work, avoiding any conversation about his youngest daughter, the one who'd escaped the life he'd planned for her. They were living their own punishment, trapped in a world where appearance mattered more than reality, where they'd lost their daughter years before she died because they'd never really tried to know her. I found myself thinking about forgiveness a lot in those months. About Sarah's words in her will about leaving her parents her love and forgiveness. It took me a long time to understand what she meant. She wasn't forgiving them for their treatment of me or even their treatment of her. She was forgiving them for being unable to be different, for being so trapped by their own upbringing and expectations that they couldn't see another way to live. She was forgiving them for all the moments they'd missed, the joy they'd never experienced, the love they'd never understood. It was the kind of forgiveness that came from pity rather than absolution, and it was probably the kindest thing she could have given them. A year after Sarah's death, I received a package from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from Sarah, one she'd arranged to have delivered on the anniversary of her death. In it, she told me about a safety deposit box she'd never mentioned, one she'd opened years ago under just her maiden name. She'd been adding to it throughout our marriage, she wrote, filling it with things that had nothing to do with money but everything to do with value. The key was hidden in her grandmother's jewelry box, the one thing from her family she'd kept on her dresser. I found the key tucked behind the velvet lining, so small I almost missed it, and drove to the bank she'd specified, a small branch in the town where we'd gotten married. The box was larger than I'd expected, and when I opened it, I understood why Sarah had kept it secret. It was filled with letters she'd written to me but never sent. One for each anniversary we'd celebrated, and many more for ordinary days when she'd wanted to capture something precious. There were ticket stubs from every concert and play we'd attended, pressed flowers from every bouquet I'd ever given her, photos I'd never seen from moments I'd forgotten. There was the napkin from the restaurant where we'd had our first date, with her phone number written in the corner and a little heart she'd drawn after I'd called. There was a notebook where she'd documented every inside joke we'd ever had, every silly nickname, every random tradition we'd created. At the very bottom was an envelope marked "Open Last," and inside was a single paragraph in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. "My dearest Michael," it read. "If you're reading this, then you've made it through the first year without me. And I'm so proud of you. I know my family has probably made it difficult, and I know you've probably been more gracious than they deserved. That's who you are, the man who sees the best in everyone, even when they show you their worst. I want you to know that every decision I made about our assets was made from love, not spite. I needed to know you would be okay, that you would have the freedom to grieve without worrying about money or fighting my family. But more than that, I needed them to know that what we had couldn't be reduced to numbers in a bank account. You were never a gold digger, my love. You were the one who showed me that the real gold was in the life we built together, the love we shared, the happiness we created. That's why you already owned everything that mattered. The rest was just paperwork." I sat in that bank vault and cried like I hadn't cried since the day she died, clutching that letter and finally understanding the full scope of Sarah's last gift to me. It wasn't just the money or the house or the protection from her family. It was the proof, carefully documented and lovingly preserved, that our life together had been real and valuable and worth protecting. It was her way of telling me that I hadn't imagined the depth of our love, that it had been as important to her as it was to me, that she'd treasured every moment just as much as I had. It was her final act of defiance against a world that measured worth in dollars, showing that the real treasure was in the memories, the laughter, the quiet moments that no one else saw or valued. I kept that safety deposit box and added to it over the years. Letters I wrote to Sarah that I couldn't send, photos of the garden as it grew and changed, programs from James's wedding in our backyard, which was beautiful and chaotic and everything Sarah would have loved. I added the newspaper clipping from when the museum opened the Sarah Morrison Chen Memorial Wing, funded by a donation I'd made in her honor. I added the thank you cards from the students who received scholarships in her name, young artists and dreamers who reminded me of the girl she'd been before the world tried to tell her who to be. I even added a photo Victoria sent me one Christmas, showing her daughter reading one of the poetry books Sarah had loved, a tiny crack in the Morrison family armor that Sarah would have celebrated. The truth about money and family and love became clearer to me as time passed. Sarah's family had been so focused on protecting their wealth that they'd forgotten to protect their relationships. They'd been so concerned about who might take advantage of them that they'd pushed away the one person who'd never wanted anything from them but their love and acceptance. They'd confused price with value, inheritance with legacy, and in doing so they'd lost the only thing that actually mattered. Sarah had understood this, had seen through the elaborate facades to the empty rooms behind them, and she'd chosen differently. She'd chosen love over money, happiness over status, authenticity over appearance, and she'd made sure that choice was protected even after she was gone. The house in New Jersey became a gathering place for the people who'd really loved Sarah. Mrs. Rodriguez and her family, my parents who visited from California, James and his wife and stepchildren, colleagues from the museum, friends from our neighborhood. We'd have barbecues in the garden, holiday dinners in the dining room, game nights in the living room where Sarah's laughter seemed to still echo. These people were Sarah's real legacy, the ones who remembered her kindness, her humor, her genuine interest in their lives. They told stories about her that had nothing to do with her maiden name or her trust fund, stories about the woman who'd helped them through difficult times, who'd celebrated their successes, who'd made them feel seen and valued for who they were rather than what they could offer. Victoria came to one of these gatherings, showing up unexpectedly on Sarah's birthday with a bottle of wine and an uncertain expression. She stood in the doorway watching the chaos of children playing in the garden, adults laughing in the kitchen, Mrs. Rodriguez teaching James's stepkids to make Sarah's favorite empanadas, and I saw her finally understand what Sarah had tried to tell her. This was wealth that couldn't be measured or inherited or stolen. This was the fortune Sarah had accumulated, the investment she'd made in people rather than portfolios. Victoria stayed for hours, helping in the kitchen, playing with the kids, listening to stories about her sister that revealed a person she'd never taken the time to know. When she left, she hugged me for the first time ever and whispered that she was sorry, not just for the gold digger comment, but for everything she'd missed while looking at the wrong things. The legal battles had ended years ago, but the emotional reckoning continued. William Morrison died of a heart attack 3 years after Sarah, leaving behind a will that divided his estate with mathematical precision among his remaining children and various charities, as if death were just another business transaction to be executed efficiently. At his funeral, which was everything Sarah's had been, grand and impersonal and coldly elegant, I sat in the back row and thought about how different things might have been if he'd ever learned to value his children for who they were, rather than what they represented. Margaret Morrison became increasingly isolated, maintaining her perfect house and her perfect appearance while her remaining children visited out of obligation rather than love. She never spoke to me again, but James told me she'd kept one photo of Sarah on her dresser, hidden behind other frames, but there nonetheless, a tiny admission that she'd lost something money couldn't buy back. 5 years after Sarah's death, I met someone. Her name was Elena. She was a social worker who lived in our neighborhood, and she understood loss in a way that made conversation easy. She didn't mind that I still wore my wedding ring on a chain around my neck, that Sarah's photos were still displayed throughout the house, that I still tended the garden Sarah had planted. She understood that loving Sarah hadn't ended with death, that my heart had room for both the love that was and the love that could be. When I finally told her the whole story about the will and the money and the gold digger comment, she laughed and said that Sarah sounded like a woman who knew how to protect what mattered. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony in the backyard, surrounded by the roses Sarah had planted, and I knew she would have approved. The money Sarah had so carefully preserved for me was put to good use over the years. Beyond the donations and scholarships, I used it to help James start a music program at his school, to help Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson pay for college, to support the local food bank Sarah had volunteered at before she got sick. I kept working, never touching the principle of what she'd left me, living off my own salary and letting Sarah's money do what she'd wanted it to do. Make the world a little better, a little kinder, a little more like the world she'd believed in. Every dollar spent was a small rebellion against the Morrison family philosophy, that money should be hoarded and protected and passed down through bloodlines, like some medieval title. 10 years after that funeral where Victoria called me a gold digger, I received an unexpected call from Mr. Whitman. Victoria had died in a car accident, and in her will she'd left me something. Not money, she knew I didn't need or want that, but a collection of childhood photos and videos of Sarah that the family had kept. There were hours of footage I'd never seen. Sarah as a gap-toothed 6-year-old putting on plays with James. Sarah at 13 rebelliously reading poetry at the country club talent show instead of playing the piano piece her mother had chosen. Sarah at 16 standing up to her father about wanting to study art history instead of business. In her accompanying letter, Victoria wrote that she'd finally understood what Sarah had tried to teach them all, that the real inheritance wasn't money, but memory, that the real legacy wasn't wealth, but love, that the real treasure wasn't what you left behind, but what you gave while you were here. I watched those videos with James and his family, with Elena, who'd never met Sarah but felt like she knew her through all our stories, with Mrs. Rodriguez, who cried at seeing young Sarah's fierce determination even as a child. We laughed at her teenage rebellion, cried at hearing her voice again, celebrated the spirit that had refused to be diminished by her family's expectations. It was like getting a piece of her back, a reminder of the girl she'd been before I met her, the strength she'd carried long before she needed it to fight cancer. Victoria's gift was more valuable than any amount of money, a recognition finally of what really mattered, what really lasted, what really defined a person's worth. The Morrison family fortune continued on without Sarah's portion, divided and subdivided among cousins and second cousins who'd never known her, invested in hedge funds and real estate that would appreciate and depreciate according to market forces. Nobody really understood, but Sarah's fortune, the one she'd built with love and protected with such fierce determination. That fortune grew in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. It grew in the students who pursued their dreams because of her scholarships, in the families fed by the program she'd funded, in the art that was created and shared because of her support. It grew in the garden that bloomed every spring, in the memories shared at every gathering, in the love that continued to ripple outward from the life she'd lived. I'm telling this story now, 15 years after Sarah's death, because I want people to understand what she understood, what her family never grasped until it was too late. The accusation of being a gold digger was both the worst insult Victoria could think of and the most ironic, because it assumed that gold was what mattered, that money was the treasure worth digging for. But Sarah knew better. She knew that the real gold was in the morning coffee we shared in comfortable silence, the evening walks where we solved the world's problems, the midnight conversations when we were too tired to be anything but honest. She knew that the real treasure was in the trust that let us share everything, the respect that let us be individuals within our partnership, the love that made us want to protect each other even beyond death. When people ask me now about that day at the funeral, about the will reading that shocked everyone, about how it felt to inherit nothing and everything simultaneously, I tell them the truth. I tell them that Sarah's final gift wasn't the money or the house or the legal protections she'd put in place. Her final gift was forcing her family and maybe the world to see that what we'd had couldn't be reduced to a number, couldn't be challenged in court, couldn't be taken away by anyone who thought they deserved it more. She made them all witness that I already owned everything because I'd already been given everything that mattered. Her trust, her love, her life shared without reservation. The money was just money. What I inherited was priceless. Mr. Whitman passed away last year at the age of 91, and his son, who'd taken over the firm, called to tell me that there was one final letter from Sarah in their files, to be delivered upon Mr. Whitman's death. I couldn't imagine what else she could have planned, what other protection she'd put in place, but I shouldn't have been surprised that she'd thought of everything. The letter was short, just a few lines, but it was perfect, Sarah. My dearest Michael, it read. If you're reading this, it means Mr. Whitman has died and you're probably wondering why I left one more letter. It's simple. I wanted to make sure you knew that even now, years after I'm gone, I'm still thinking of you, still protecting you, still loving you. That's what real wealth looks like. That's what real inheritance means. That's why you already owned everything that mattered from the moment you chose to love me back. The rest, as I always said, was just paperwork. All my love, always and forever, Sarah. I keep that final letter in the safety deposit box with all the others, another piece of evidence that love is the only currency that really matters. The Morrison family still exists in their rarefied world of country clubs and trust funds, though James has broken free and lives a life Sarah would have been proud of. Victoria's daughter reached out to me recently, wanting to know about her Aunt Sarah, the one who'd chosen differently, and I told her everything, showed her the photos and videos, introduced her to the people who'd loved Sarah for who she was rather than what she represented. She's 22 now, the same age Sarah was when we met, and I can see her beginning to question the values she's been raised with, beginning to wonder if there might be another way to measure success. The house in New Jersey is still full of life, full of the people Sarah brought together and the ones who've joined our unconventional family since. Elena and I have 2 children now, and they grow up hearing stories about the Aunt Sarah who loved gardens and poetry and people, who fought for what mattered, who understood that the best things in life aren't things at all. They play in the garden she planted, read the books she loved, learn the lessons she taught about value and worth and what it really means to be rich. When they're old enough, I'll tell them the whole story, about the funeral and the will and the gold digger comment, and I'll explain what Sarah knew all along, that the real gold isn't something you dig for. It's something you build, something you share, something you protect not with lawyers and contracts, but with love and trust and the courage to choose differently. Sometimes I dream about Sarah, and in those dreams she's always laughing about something, usually at the absurdity of her family thinking I married her for money, when the truth was so much simpler and so much more valuable. I married her because she was brilliant and kind and funny and brave. I married her because she saw through all the superficial nonsense to what really mattered. I married her because she was the first person who ever made me feel like I was enough just as I was. And she married me for the same reasons, not in spite of my lack of pedigree or fortune, but because of who I was without those things. That's why she made sure I kept everything that mattered. Why she protected our life together even in death. Why she turned her family's worst accusation into proof of our love's true worth. The story could end here, with me having inherited nothing and everything, with Sarah's family finally understanding what they'd lost, with the money doing good in the world as Sarah intended. But life doesn't really end neatly like stories do. It continues messy and complicated and beautiful. James comes for dinner every week with his family. Victoria's daughter is studying social work, inspired by the aunt she never really knew. Margaret Morrison, now in her 80s, sent me a card last Christmas. The first communication we'd had in years. With just 4 words, Sarah would be proud. Even she, finally, understands what her daughter had tried to teach them all. The garden blooms every spring, more beautiful each year, as the plants Sarah chose mature and spread. The roses climb higher on the trellis she installed. The fruit trees she planted now provide shade and sustenance. The vegetable garden feeds not just our She showed that a life measured in kindness and connection and authenticity is worth more than any trust fund. She demonstrated that choosing love over money, happiness over status, truth over appearance isn't just romantically idealistic, but practically wise. And she made sure that even death couldn't diminish the value of what we'd built together. So when people ask me about that day at the funeral, when Victoria called me a gold digger and the will revealed I inherited nothing because I already owned everything, I smile and think of Sarah, who knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that the real scandal wasn't that she'd given everything to her husband before she died, but that her family couldn't understand why that was the most natural thing in the world. She knew that the real shock wasn't the empty estate, but the full life she'd lived outside their narrow definitions of success. She knew that the real inheritance she was leaving wasn't money, but a different way of seeing the world. One where love is the only currency that matters and the only wealth worth accumulating is the kind you can't count. The rain has stopped now, 15 years after it started on the day Sarah died. The sun shines on the garden she planted, on the family she brought together, on the life she protected and preserved not in bank accounts but in hearts and memories and ongoing acts of love. I still wear my wedding ring on a chain around my neck, even though I'm remarried because some promises transcend death and some loves never really end. Elena understands this just as she understands that loving Sarah taught me how to love her, that grieving Sarah taught me to cherish every moment, that losing Sarah taught me what really matters. The gold digger comment meant as an insult became a badge of honor because I did dig for gold. I just knew, thanks to Sarah, exactly where to find it. If you like the story, comment below where you are watching from.